At 06 local time, this American F-22 Raptor pilot was on a mission that was insane, even by U.S. Air Force standards. A low-altitude penetration strike on a key Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps command bridge through the most contested airspace on Earth. But what he'd discover about Iran's newest weapon system would change how every air force on the planet thinks about modern air combat. The mission briefing said this corridor was open. It was wrong, and he was about to find out at 900 kilometers per hour over the skies of northwestern Iran in the spring of 2026. The F-22 screamed east so low that the sun-baked desert terrain beneath him blurred into a tan-brown smear. This was the approach. U.S.-controlled airspace first, then the gray zone where radar coverage changed by the hour, and then the heart of Iranian air defense territory. 35 kilometers to the release point. 15 minutes of low-level flight through airspace that intelligence had mapped, that ground controllers had deconflicted, and that was supposed to be survivable. The air around him was not empty. I learned from watching 4 years of drone warfare in Eastern Europe. They had taken every lesson the Russians published in blood over Ukraine and applied it to their own doctrine with terrifying. Above of the pilot, between 100 and 300 meters, Iranian and American reconnaissance drones tracked movement across contested zone near the Zagros foothills. Below, hugging the deck at 20 to 50 meters, Iranian Shahed variants and American counter-drone platforms hunted man in an increasingly robotic war that'd been simmering for months before it finally boiled over. The pilot was threading the gap between them. 50 meters, right in the middle, a corridor where friendly traffic had been temporarily grounded and enemy activity was supposed to be minimal. The F-22's low observable coating made him nearly invisible to conventional radar, and that was the word that would matter today. That's when his launch warning system screamed. The sound was wrong, not the rhythmic pulse of a search radar finding him, not the urgent warble of a surface-to-air missile lock. This was a single sharp tone. Missile guidance already active, already tracking. Something had shot at him, and he hadn't seen it coming. The pilot reacted on instinct. Stick back, throttle forward, flares into the slipstream. The F-22's nose pitched up as the G-forces crushed him into his ejection seat. He was climbing, loss of turn masking at 100 meters, 150, 200, trading his stealth advantage for the chance to outrun whatever was behind him. The missile, if it was a missile, didn't catch him. No impact, no explosion, just the fading scream of whatever had been tracking him, lost to luck, and the flare cloud burning hot in his wake. But now he was at 300 meters, exposed, and his radar warning receiver was lighting up with new threats. An Iranian Bar-363's battery to the south was painting him with search energy. A Rush-supplied S-300 PMU-2 somewhere to the northeast was beginning its acquisition sequence. He had jumped out of one trap and straight into another, exactly the kind of layered engagement envelope that Iran's air defense commanders had spent a decade designing specifically to kill aircraft. Then he saw them. Two shapes, maybe 3 kilometers out, silhouetted against the pale morning sky over the Iranian plateau. Delta wings, large, unmistakable, slow and loitering. Turning toward him, Mohajer 10 drones. The color left his face. He had been briefed on this, the new Iranian tactic that had been observed in exercises since late 2025. Iran's aerospace forces had begun strapping indigenous Azarakhsh air-to-air missiles to their Mohajer 10 and Shahed 149 reconnaissance drones, turning long-endurance surveillance platforms into aerial hunters. The concept had been borrowed wholesale from what Russian forces had begun doing with Jiran drones over Ukraine, and Iran's engineers had moved fast. These weren't experimental prototypes anymore. They were operational. They had been placed specifically in this corridor, specifically at this altitude, specifically to swat American aircraft flying low-altitude strike missions exactly like the one he was flying right now. The Azarakhsh was infrared-guided, an Iranian reverse-engineered derivative of older Soviet seeker technology, updated with modern focal plane array components acquired through sanctions-busting supply chains running through intermediaries in Central Asia and the Gulf. His radar warning receiver couldn't detect the launch because there was no radar to warn him about. No radar meant no warning, just a heat seeker dropped from a drone that had been waiting in a pre-planned orbit for exactly this moment, patient as a spider in a web that American intelligence had failed to map before wheels up this morning. The Mohajer drones were turning toward him now. If they had more missiles, he was about to find out. He rolled hard and dove, dumping flares, trying to break their angle. At 200 meters, he was still too high. The Bavar radar was tracking him, building a firing solution with the methodical patience of automated systems that didn't feel pressure or panic. If he stayed up there much longer, it would fire. But the Mohajers were above him now, and going lower meant giving them a perfect heat signature angle straight into both engine exhausts. Another flash from the lead drone. The second one had fired. The pilot shoved the stick forward and dove for the deck. Afterburners screaming, flares streaming behind him like a comet tail across the Iranian morning sky. The Azarakhsh missiles were not the most sophisticated weapons in Iran's arsenal. Their seekers trackers were distractible, designed for a threat environment that hadn't anticipated American-grade countermeasures. He leveled at 40 meters, so low he could see individual scrub bushes whipping past in the desert terrain below him. His radar warning receiver showed the Bavar still radiating but not yet launching. He had dropped below their engagement envelope floor, so low that the curvature of the terrain was masking him from the radar's line of sight, which bought him seconds of something resembling safety. Above him, the missiles were chasing heat signatures that weren't attached to his aircraft anymore. The second Azarakh detonated on flares. Both drones, now out of their air-to-air payloads, continued their lazy observation orbits above him. They couldn't shoot him anymore, but they were talking to something that absolutely could. The pilot exhaled. He was alive. He was also completely off course. The evasion had pushed him north, away from the planned corridor, airspace that hadn't been deconflicted and that American electronic intelligence had only partially mapped. His heading was wrong. His altitude was wrong, and when he keyed his encrypted radio to request a new vector, the response came back fragmented through Iranian jamming that had degraded the data link. Corridor compromised, working alternate, then static. It sounded like the OWACS crew was trying to rebuild a picture of airspace that was evolving faster than any sensor network could track. Right now, over northwestern Iran in 2026, he was suddenly alone in a way that American fighter pilots almost never are. The pilot checked his instruments, tried to reorient using the inertial navigation backup that the F-22's mission computers maintained independently of GPS. The release point was still out there, 22 kilometers east. The mission was still valid. The IRGC command node was still active. American ground forces operating in coordination with partner forces along the border were counting on this strike to collapse the command and control structure, directing Iranian drone swarm attacks against forward positions. He just had to get there through airspace that nobody had cleared and that nobody in the Air Operations Center could currently see clearly. He turned east and pushed the throttle forward into military power, and that's when he saw the drones. A stream of them, maybe 200 meters ahead, crossing his flight path at his altitude. Small, fast, dark against the pale Iranian sky, Shaheds and their variants, a mix of Iranian strike drones heading toward American and partner positions, and what appeared to be American counter-drone interceptors chasing them in the opposite direction. He couldn't tell which was which at this speed, and it didn't matter, because at 900 kilometers per hour, he was closing on them at 250 meters per second, and there was nothing he could do but fly through. They passed beneath him, above him, around him. By the time his eyes registered movement, the drones were already behind him, and new ones were appearing ahead. The pilot's hands tightened around the stick. This was the scenario that had existed only in threat briefings and tabletop exercises 18 months ago. Iran had spent the years watching drone warfare transform the battlefield in Ukraine and had applied those lessons with a speed and seriousness that American planners had publicly acknowledged but privately underestimated. The Khuzestan corridor and the Zagros approach routes had become the most drone-saturated airs the United States military had faced since the invention of the jet engine. Dozens of platforms per kilometer of contested frontage on a slow day, but right now, caught in the middle of an ongoing Iranian drone offensive timed to coincide with the American strike package, the density was extraordinary. His AN/AR-56 missile launch detector was not designed for this. His AN/APG-77 AESA radar was the finest airborne radar ever installed in a production fighter, capable of detecting conventional aircraft at ranges that bordered on science fiction. But small commercial derivative drones with radar cross-sections measured in fractions of a square centimeter were invisible to it at anything but point-blank range. His infrared search and track systems couldn't reliably separate cold plastic and lithium polymer batteries from background clutter at low altitude over warm desert terrain. Every sensor in the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built had been optimized for a threat that looked like a MiG-29 or an Su-35, not for what the sky over Iran looked like in 2026. The only sensors that mattered in this moment were his eyes, and at 900 kilometers per hour, covering a football field every 4/10 of a second, his eyes were not fast enough. He was relying on reflexes honed by thousands of hours in simulators and real flight on a visual threat detection loop that evolution had spent millions of years optimizing for savanna predators, not for drone swarms in contested airspace. His radio crackled with a fragmented transmission from the WACS controller trying to reach him through the jamming. Heavy activity beat 50 and 200 meters. Stay below 50 if able. He nudged the stick forward, dropping to 45 meters above the Iranian desert, lower than some of the terrain features around him, threading through wadis and dry riverbeds that the mission planning software had mapped from satellite imagery 2 days ago when they were empty. At this altitude, the threat geometry changed completely. The Iranian fiber optic guided drones that begun appearing in the conflict, thin wires trailing behind attack platforms that Iranian operators flew from hardened control sites kilometers away, were a particular nightmare. radar. A wire into his intake at this speed would shred his compressor blades and turn 35,000 pounds of thrust into an expanding cloud of titanium fragments. He'd never see the wire coming. His radar couldn't detect it. His sensors couldn't warn him. The threat was literally invisible, a hair-thin filament connecting a drone above him to an operator below the horizon, and the only defense was altitude separation that he currently couldn't afford. Another broken transmission. American interceptors active in the sector. Airspace contested. Recommended vectors unavailable. His own side's counter-drone platforms were now in the mix, adding more objects to airspace that was already beyond any reasonable definition of safe. Then a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Close. Too close. A drone maybe 50 meters away, crossing left to right, large enough that he could make out the delta wing platform before it was gone. He didn't have time to react before it was behind him. Then another, below, skimming across the desert floor. Then a cluster ahead and high, black specks against the pale sky that his brain tried to pattern match against everything it had ever learned about airborne threats, and came up empty because there was no precedent for this. The pilot made a decision. He couldn't stay in this altitude band. Every second here was a probability calculation trending rapidly toward the wrong answer. The mission was still 15 kilometers ahead, and the odds of reaching it through the swarm were deteriorating with every passing second. There was only one way out. He shoved the throttle past the detent into full afterburner. Both F-119 engines roared as raw fuel dumped to the exhaust streams, each engine pushing 35,000 pounds of thrust and painting him as the brightest heats in the sky for 50 kilometers in every direction. The F-22 surged forward, acceleration climbing toward the edge of what the airframe was designed to sustain at low altitude. Then he pulled back on the stick and started climbing. Not to mission altitude, not to a safe altitude, into the engagement envelope of Iranian surface-to-air missiles. Up and out, trading the invisible statistical threat of drone collision for the visible, trackable, counterable threat of radar-guided missiles, because at least those he knew how to fight. An Iranian RAD radar found him immediately. His radar warning receiver lit up as a tracking radar locked on, painting him with electromagnetic energy that would guide a missile straight to his aircraft. He was at 500 meters, then 1,000, then 2,000. The radar held him the entire way up, building a firing solution, calculating intercept geometry with cold mathematical precision. The toss bombing maneuver he was setting up was a technique as old as the nuclear age, developed in the 1950s for aircraft that needed to throw gravity bombs at targets without overflying them. American pilots had practiced it for decades in peacetime exercises against simulated threats. Nobody had practiced it with an Iranian integrated air defense system actively tracking them and a drone swarm visible in the rearview mirror. The textbook said this maneuver required a permissive threat environment. The textbook had never been to northwestern Iran in 2026. The pilot held his climb, 2,500 meters, 3,000. The Iranian battery could fire at any second. If a missile launched, he'd roughly 8 seconds to process his options. But if he broke off now, if he aborted the mission and turned west, he would have flown through everything that airspace had thrown at him for nothing. American forces on the ground were waiting for this strike. The command node he was targeting had directed 3 successful attacks on U.S. positions in the last 36 hours. The mission was valid. The bridge was there. The target was real. 3,500 meters. His mission computer showed release parameters approaching. The Iranian tracking radar was still painting him, still building its solution, and the pilot understood with the cold clarity that combat produces that he was placing a very large bet on a very tight margin. Could he release his weapons and dive below the radar horizon before the missile reached him? 4,000 meters. His weapons release cue flickered yellow. Close enough. His thumb found the release. 2 distinct thuds shook the airframe as the GBU-39 small diameter bombs fell away, their folding wings deploying as their guidance systems came online and began the journey to target coordinates that the mission computer had locked in before takeoff. The pilot was already moving for the second bomb cleared the rack, stick forward, rolling inverted, pulling through a split S maneuver at an angle and altitude that no instructor would have approved in peacetime. The F-22's nose dropped toward the Iranian plateau as he traded altitude for speed in a dive that pushed the airframe toward structural limits. Behind him, the bomb's glide paths were calculating their routes to target. The Iranian battery fired. His radar warning receiver screamed the launch warning as a missile roared off its launcher somewhere to the south, accelerating to Mach 4 in the thin air above the Iranian highlands, its seeker head searching for the brightest radar return in its field of view. The missile Iran had fired was a Sayyad Qatr-B, a domestically produced medium-range surface-to-air weapon that Iranian state media had been promoting for 2 years. It was semi-active radar homing in its terminal phase, meaning it required continuous illumination from the ground radar to guide it to target. The same principle as shining a flashlight at something and having the missile chase the reflected light. If the pilot could break that illumination by dropping below the radar's line line of sight, the missile would lose its guidance and go ballistic. The math was not comfortable. The missile was closing at approximately 200 meters per second. Distance to the radar was roughly 9 kilometers. Time to impact, 7 seconds, maybe 8. Time to reach terrain masking at his current dive angle, 6 seconds, maybe 7. 1 second of margin, perhaps. The pilot held the dive, 2,000 meters, 1,500. The airframe was buffeting now at the edge of what the flight control computers were designed to manage. The fly-by-wire system fighting him slightly as it tried to protect the aircraft from exceeding its structural envelope while he was trying to fly through that envelope as fast as physics allowed. 1,000 meters. He could see the texture of the Iranian landscape below him, the particular brown gold of the plateau in early morning light, individual features resolving out of the blur. At 600 meters he started the pull-out. G-forces built rapidly, graying his vision at the edges, the ATAG system in his suit inflating against his legs and abdomen to keep blood in his brain. He held the pull because leveling out 1 second too early meant the radar would still have line of sight, and the missile would still track, and the math would stop working in his favor. At 180 meters, wings level, he was racing west at maximum dry thrust, below the radar horizon, below the Iranian battery's ability to illuminate him. His radar warning receiver showed the Iranian tracking radar searching, hunting, its energy sweeping the sky, above him looking for the return that had suddenly vanished. Then the warning tone ceased. He had dropped below the horizon. The guidance link to the Sayad 4B broke 3 seconds before the missile reached his last known position. Its guidance computer, receiving no illumination to chase, executed its terminal logic. The proximity fuse armed and searched for anything solid. It found empty sky over the Iranian plateau. The warhead detonated 280 meters above the terrain, its fragmentation pattern raining down on empty desert that had been a battlefield for only a few minutes and would be empty again by noon. The pilot exhaled for the second time in this mission. He was alive. His bombs were flying their glide paths to the target. And he was about to do something that no amount of simulator time fully prepares you, which was fly back through the drone swarm he had just escaped, this time with lower fuel state, higher pilot fatigue, and the certain knowledge that Iranian operators had now tracked his general position and were actively repositioning assets to catch him on the egress. The safe corridor west had been marked compromised by the AWACS controller before the radio contact degraded. The only option was to retrace his path through airspace that remained saturated and contested, and that nobody in the Air Operations Center had a clean picture of. He dropped to 40 meters and pushed west. Behind him, the GBU-39s were threading through Iranian GPS jamming using their inertial navigation backup modes, their small onboard computers doing the dead reckoning mathematics that GPS denial had made necessary. The Americans had learned from watching Iran and Russia jam Ukrainian precision munitions for years. The SDB's guidance package had been hardened and updated specifically for this environment. Accuracy in heavy jamming degraded from under a meter to somewhere between 5 and 15 meters. Still lethal, still mission capable, but the difference between a direct hit on a reinforced command node and a near miss that left the structure standing was now a question of drift accumulation over the final 14 kilometers of glide path. The drones were still there as he crossed back into the contested zone, the same chaotic mix of Iranian strike platforms and American counter-drone interceptors sharing airspace with no coordinating authority and no collision avoidance. His eyes tracked every shadow, every flicker of movement against the morning sky. His hands were steady on the controls with the steadiness that comes not from calm, but from the total absorption of a human nervous system that has run out of bandwidth for anything except the immediate task of survival. A shape crossed his nose at maybe 80 meters. Another appeared below, skimming the desert floor, trailing what might have been a fiber optic wire, or might have been his imagination working against him. He flew through the space where it had been and kept going because the only direction that led home was forward. His radio crackled with the clearest transmission he had received in the last 12 minutes. Impact, assess direct. His bombs had found the target. 15 kilometers behind him, both GBU-39s had struck the IRGC command facility within 2 seconds of each other, their hardened penetrator cases driving through the reinforced roof before the delay-fused warheads detonated inside. The command node that had been coordinating drone attacks on American positions for 36 hours went offline in a single second. The Iranian drone operators who had been waiting on the egress suddenly had no coordination, no updated targeting data, no picture of where he was. He was through the swarm before he fully realized it. The drone density thinned as he crossed back into the buffer zone and then into airspace where American electronic warfare assets had established a bubble of relative electromagnetic control. Ground control's voice came through clean and professional. Roadrunner 11, picture clear west of checkpoint Zulu. You are in friendly coverage. He gave his fuel state. It was amber, emergency, but not comfortable. The AWACS controller gave him a direct vector to the tanker track that had been holding at altitude for exactly exactly this contingency. He climbed out of the weeds for the first time in 22 minutes, trading the invisible dangers of low altitude for the clean, radar transparent sky at 20,000 feet where the war looked like geometry on a screen instead of shapes appearing out of the blur at 250 meters per second. He rendezvoused with the K-46 tanker 40 minutes later, plugged in, and took on fuel without saying much. There wasn't much to say. The debrief would extract everything that mattered: the sequence of events, the Iranian drone missile tactic, the effectiveness of the new Mohajer-10 Hunter configuration, the gaps in the pre-mission intelligence picture that had put him in a corridor that wasn't clear. Every detail would go into reports that would land on desks at Langley and the Pentagon, and in the classified annex of the Air Force's Lessons Learned database. And within 30 days, every fighter squadron in the American inventory would briefing on what happened in that corridor over northwestern Iran at 12 on a Tuesday morning in 2026. The Iranian attempt to shoot down an F-22 with drone-launched infrared missiles had failed. Both drones were gone, their Azarakhsh payloads expended on flares. The surface-to-air missile had detonated in empty air. The command node was rubble, but the fact that an F-22, the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built, had been forced to fly a different mission than the one it briefed, had been surprised by a threat its sensors couldn't see coming, had been forced to improvise through a threat environment no pre-mission planning had fully anticipated. That was the story. Not the kill, not the survival. The fact that a 150 million aircraft with the most advanced sensor suite in aviation history had spent 12 minutes where its greatest vulnerability was a drone the size of a coffee table launched by an adversary that had watched 4 years of Ukrainian war footage and done their homework. The Iranian tactic would be briefed in every air force on the planet within weeks, not because it had worked, because it almost had, and in the business of air combat, almost is the number that matters most.